Testing, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Let's see. We got a lot of problems here, folks. I think Geezy Truth News is getting banned or something's going on. That last vid, I think they blocked it or banned it or something. I haven't gotten anything yet. But we're going to take a look at all this sneezing, man. Let's get real up in here. For real, for real. So anyway, without further ado, we got to get this sneezing on the road. Let's see. Thank you very much. Testing 1, 2, 1, 2. All right. That's right, everybody. We back in action. It is Geezy Truth News. Thank you, everybody. It is. Can't believe it. July 23rd, 2020. That's insane, man. What's going on? Let me tell you, what's going on in the world, man? What's going on with all these guys, man? And the Fed, pedogate, all these problems, man. You gotta be pleasing me, man. You know? I mean, can we get a yeah? Or can we get a yeah? We got a special correspondent. We got a VIP coming up. Whew. Let me tell you, man. The good guys are winning. I'm telling you. The good guys are winning, but there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. We don't know. But let me know if they banned that last video, because I try to see it and it doesn't show anything. It says that the video is not available. So I don't know what's going on. The last video. Who knows? Whether it's technical difficulties, or we're getting shadow banned, or there's some kind of problems. Let's see. Thank you. Thank you. Lots of interesting stuff with the economy too. 27,000 Dow Jones Industrial Average. Bitcoin, last I checked, is at 9,500. Gold is going up 1850. Or did it hit 19 already? So, this is what's going on. Let's get it together here, folks. Alright, this is good. Let's see.
Whom you're trying to reach is currently unavailable. Please leave a message after the beep.
Again, you know, with all these technical difficulties, we're gonna give it a go here. What's going on here again? Oh, okay, here we go. We're back in action. Here we go. I'm telling you, man, whether they're doing DW or something else, it's always something. Well, here we go. Something serious going on. Whew. We're almost here. We're almost here, kids. Almost there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So you want me to just lay out what's going on for about 30 minutes? Is that it?
That sounds fantastic. You ready?
Okay.
All right, here, hold on. Let me get this. Give me a few moments here. Everything good with you? How are you, Jim?
Yeah, everything's good. Thanks. Yes.
Fantastic. Here, hold on. All right. All right, on 1, 2, 3. Hello, Jim. Thank you very much for coming back on Geezy Truth News. It's been a while. Hope you're well. Let us know what's going on, how you're doing. What's the intel?
Yeah, let me give you a global overview of what's going on here in the United States, which is the greatest hoax in the history of America. I always thought the moon landing hoax would be the all-time record. But what's taking place here in America for its scope and complexity and ramifications and devastating effects for American citizens far exceeds the relatively comparatively trivial consequences of the moon landing hoax. That a lot of us have a false belief about having gone to the moon and back when it was actually physically and technically impossible, has relatively minor ramifications, perhaps reflecting on the absence of scientific superiority of the United States, which was supposed to have been thereby demonstrated where the entire moon landing hoax was initiated by the USSR launching Sputnik, which was the first satellite circling Earth. When JFK declared the intention to send a man to the moon by the end of the century, he was clearly not well informed about the prospects because, to make one obvious observation, the Van Allen radiation belt would have rendered any prospect of traveling to the moon impossible. Indeed, we have in the last couple of years had a NASA spokesman admit that the principal obstacle to manned missions to Mars is the Van Allen radiation belt. But of course, if it's an obstacle to manned missions to Mars today, it most certainly was an obstacle to manned missions to the moon then, which would have required something like 6 feet of lead in order to preserve. Just think about it. If you go to a dentist and he wants to do a dental x-ray, you're covered with a coat of lead for a millisecond of exposure. So not only, but it turns out we didn't have the propulsion power the Saturn that was in use to bring a spacecraft out of low Earth orbit. We didn't have the computer capability. The average iPhone has more computer capability than all that's available to NASA at the time. And indeed, as Dennis Camino, who was the Navy's top electronics troubleshooter before he resigned and went to work for Raytheon, has observed, the computer they show in their designs is not even a functional computer. I mean, it's ridiculous. Not to mention the fact we didn't have the communication capacity. At one point, Huffington Post put up a very banal post claiming that a brilliant physicist had defeated all moon landing skeptics in a single tweet, when it said something as ridiculous as anyone who thinks we didn't go to the moon needs to have a brain transplant. It was that bad. Where I took advantage of the opportunity to post one after another proof that we had not gone to the moon, and where the most interesting comment in response was from a fellow who was in communications at the time, who explained that broadcasting in 1969 and 70 would have required a van the size of a bread truck. Well, you may have noticed there weren't any vans the size of bread trucks on the moon. And you may also have noticed that there was no time delay. We're talking about a distance of 250,000 miles. If there had been a communication between Earth and the moon, there would have been a substantial delay, but it's as though they were talking on phones right here in the USA, which undoubtedly was the case. Now, the hoax we're dealing with here was very, very cleverly planned. It turns out that coronavirus is the common cold virus, and while they're claiming this is a distinct species thereof, they have not been able to isolate what they call technically the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And if they haven't been able to isolate the virus, you can be assured they cannot have or be producing a vaccine to deal with the virus. In fact, it turns out that what we're dealing with here is relatively effortlessly dealt with a highly inexpensive anti-malarial drug called hydroxychloroquine, where I just taken a set of dosages. Hydroxychloroquine is a virtual miracle drug, a wonder drug with regard to COVID. It'll not only cure it if you have it, but it functions as a preventative if you don't. And where Dr. Anthony Tony the Rat Fauci has known that coronavirus, that hydroxychloroquine is a wonder drug for coronavirus already since at least 2005, when an article was published in the journal Virology of the National Institutes of Health explaining how it works so successfully. In the early stages, by the way, we had one physician after another reporting how they had, in the case of one physician in France, 350 patients, and they were in dire straits, and he treated them with hydroxychloroquine and a Z-Pack, an antibiotic, and zinc, and all of his patients survived save one. We've had similar effects right here in the United States. Another patient with another doctor with a very large group of patients, treated them with hydroxychloroquine, the Z-Pack, and zinc, and he had 100% success. We had a doctor in New York who had, as I recall, 500 patients he's treated, and all of them have survived and lived, and none have died. So this was a blunder in the promotion of this elaborate scam on the American people. They didn't realize, they overlooked that there was in fact a readily available, highly inexpensive antidote that would solve any infection with the COVID virus, which means that Anthony Fauci has known since 2005 nobody had to die. Now, when you're hearing these stunning numbers, what's going on is the original numbers were manufactured. You heard a lot of stories about hospitals being, swamped with COVID patients. These have continued to this day. But I early on was sent a record of mortality across the European continent. And for like 30 different nations, there was no increase in mortality during the period of the purported epidemic. We've had American citizen journalists go to hospitals all over the USA and find not only are they not overwhelmed with COVID patients, but they're virtually empty. We've had German journalists go to German hospitals, find the very same thing. Now, the key to what was going on is the following. The hospitals, in concert with Big Pharma, which are massive money makers, have exploited this alleged pandemic, better known as a scamdemic, to make piles and piles of money. Minnesota State Senator Scott Jensen, for example, who is himself an MD, was very troubled when he was asked to identify a patient who had died as a COVID-19 patient when he had never been tested. This made Scott Jensen highly suspicious, and he discovered, what others have reported, that the hospitals were being paid $13,000 for every patient that they admitted that they identified as a COVID patient, and $36,000 for every patient that they put on a ventilator. So obviously there was a profit motive to drive up the numbers, but they all appear to have been massively rigged. If you, from the beginning, were to compare the number of deaths from COVID versus, say, from the seasonal flu, you find the seasonal flu was bringing about 3 times as many, and vastly other endeavors and problems encountered by human beings were causing many, many more times deaths than that. In fact, I did a whole piece about the COVID phenomenon, medical emergency or political pandemic, where you'll find a demonstration proof of every claim I'm making here and now. You can find it on the website, jimtheconspiracyguy.com, because I've recently begun doing a series of Conspiracy Guy shows on Sundays, and then on Tuesdays and Thursdays I do a supplemental show called The Fetzer Presents, where I interview fabulous figures who are experts in one area or another. I began with, for example, Scott Bennett, who's a former U.S. Army Intel and PSYOPs officer. I did Carl Herman, who's a nationally recognized history, economics, and math teacher, very smart guy. I've recently done Kevin Barrett, who's an expert on the 3 great Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I have done an interview with Dr. Catherine Horton, who's a particle physicist from Oxford, who has, in fact, been leading a campaign against targeted individuals, persons who are targeted by directed energy weapons as forms of harassment and punishment. She has a brilliant website, stop007.com. Dr. Catherine Horton. You can find all these shows and a series of subsequent Conspiracy Guy programs, including on the moon landing hoax, on the New Zealand shooting. I have two-parter on how to spot a false flag, where I go through 15 or 20 of these different phony contrived events, many of which are going to come as a surprise to you because you will have never realized that they were staged and faked, where nobody died, including not only Sandy Hook, but the Boston bombing, Orlando, Charlottesville, Parkland, Las Vegas. I'm saying if you want to, burnish your credentials as a critical thinker, these are programs you do not want to miss. And they're all there archived at jimtheconspiracyguy.com. Now, with regard to this COVID business, David Icke gave a brilliant interview with the BBC early on, which they then sought to suppress, in which he explained that this was an attempt to wipe out the American middle class by going after small businesses which would be unable to sustain an economic lockdown. Indeed, early on I was reporting how of the 5.7 million U.S. companies, 90% have 20 or fewer employees, and where Investment Watch blog had noted, again, early on, that 75% of that 90% could not sustain a loss of revenue for more than a month, where it's now been well over 2 months and even approaching 2.5, because of which the American economy is in a devastating state. Now, there are multiple motives and operators at work here. I think the most important to appreciate is the fact that the Democrats have been so concerned about Donald Trump that they have tried one phony stratagem after another to take him out of office. This even began before his inauguration. And I'm sorry to report that Barack Obama and Susan Rice, as well as James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, a host of other ne'er-do-wells in the FBI and the Department of Justice, including, it appears, Loretta Lynch, Valerie Jarrett, an Obama protege, were all involved in this. I actually have a book about it entitled Exposing the Russia Hoax. Now, that began even before the inauguration, where a lot of the to-do was based upon a manufactured opposition research dossier authored by a former MI6 agent by the name of Christopher Steele, who, when the FBI began to interrogate him, explained to the agents right off the bat that he had done this as an employee of Hillary Clinton. So we had this phony Russian dossier manufactured by Christopher Steele, paid for by Hillary Clinton, that was alleging that Donald Trump had hired a couple of prostitutes to pee on a bed where Barack Obama and Michelle had slept. Now, this is not only tawdry, but it's completely ridiculous, as the Donald himself observed at the time. He would never do something like that he's a germaphobe. He has an allergy to unsanitary circumstances, and certainly a couple of prostitutes being on a bed would qualify. But nevertheless, the Democrats went forward moving the Russia hoax as though it were a serious matter. For 2.5 years, we were bombarded by completely manufactured rubbish 24/7 until Robert Mueller finally testified before Congress, and it became obvious he didn't even know the contents of his own report, that he had never looked at the origins of all these claims of alleged improper activity on the part of members of the Clinton the Trump campaign or the Trump administration, and it collapsed. Now the Democrats weren't satisfied, and they made the practice of claiming Trump had done something one of their own had done, to wit, that he had sought to bring about a quid pro quo with Ukraine, which turned out to be completely false. Even the three key witnesses who had actually listened into the conversation testified to Congress subsequently that they knew of nothing illegal or improper about the conversation with the president of Ukraine, but that it had been, their differences with the president were matters of policy. Well, as the president of the United States, he's entitled to adopt whatever foreign policy he may prefer, and it may bear a close proximity to that on which he campaigned, or it may not. One tell, I think, significant about Donald Trump is if you look at the last 6 presidents, 5 of the 6 got the United States engaged in warfare, some of them as many as 5 different wars during their administration. The one solitary exception is the present president, which hasn't initiated any war whatsoever. He has done things of which I profoundly disagree, such as pulling out of the Iran deal, but then it turns out that Iran wasn't seeking to develop nuclear weapons in the first place, as our own big 3 intel agencies had concluded already in 2007, reaffirmed in 2011, where even the Mossad came on board in 2012, that Iran was not seeking to develop nuclear weapons just 3 weeks before Bibi Netanyahu went to the United States and asserted precisely the opposite. Now, in order to pull off this, so that was an absurdity. Then they went forward with the impeachment. No one thought there was any prospect whatsoever of the impeachment succeeding. And indeed, it was in December of last year when reports began to emerge, in particular a Rasmussen poll of black likely voters, that as much as 40% of black likely voters were going to support Trump, and for good reason. The robust economy he had developed and the surging stock market really was raising all boats. And indeed, the wages for the lowest paid wage earners were rising at the fastest rate. Now, because Trump was not only raising their wages, but cutting off immigration of illegals across our southern border, persons who would be willing to work for even lower wages and fewer benefits, if any at all, the black community had been able to elevate its quality of life across the board, and many blacks were appreciative. and questioning how Donald Trump could do this in roughly 3 years when the Democrats had been unable to do anything in all of the 8 of Bill Clinton and the 8 of Barack Obama. And the fact of the matter is, the Clintons and the Obamas did not care. They did not care. They took for granted that blacks were going to vote Democrat, and therefore they didn't need to raise their least digit on their behalf. Well, Donald Trump shook them up pretty seriously, and they realized they needed to try something else. Well, began with the COVID pandemic, which was played down by Tony the Rat, Bill Gates. It all had ancient roots. Bill Gates had been conducting seminars for 10 or 15 years about the great risk for the future was a global pandemic, not nuclear war. And it's clear that he was conducting these seminars to lay the foundation for what would be a manufactured, a fake global pandemic based upon this virus, coronavirus, which is so common that if you have had what's known as the common cold, you are going to have, or in most cases will have, antibodies from having dealt with the common cold, where one of the keys now to how they perpetuated the myth is that they have a test that, when applied, doesn't discriminate. They're mixing tests for antibodies and claiming that means you have the COVID-19 when it simply means that you've had the common cold. In fact, when the influence, the impact, economic in particular, of the scamdemic began to drop, they redefined how to count COVID patients, so that now, if you had one person who was identified as positive, they would count the number of people who had come into contact with him, which averaged 17. So they got a multiplier of 17 for every case. But it's much worse than that. As my colleague Dean Ryan on Real Deal reports, in one of our very first, where we spent like 60 consecutive days reporting on the COVID-19 virus, very early on discovered that a company in Los Angeles were manufacturing COVID test kits that were already designed to give a positive result. Now, just to confirm how that's been going on, we got an older guy in Texas who's been very troubled by all of this, and whose doctor, too, doesn't think something funny is going on, who got a packet of test kits, 10 different test kits, and sent them in for evaluation. They had never been applied to anybody, and all 10 came back positive. What you have going on, therefore, is that the Democrats are desperately trying to keep the economy in a lockdown. You have the Democratic governors of multiple states who are exemplified most blatantly by Gavin Newsom, the gruesome Newsom in California, who is going to turn California into a wasteland, all in a misguided attempt to destroy the economy, to hold it against Donald Trump. Now, the Donald has been doing everything he can to deal with this. He was early on advocating the benefit of hydroxychloroquine with a Z-Pack and zinc. Tony the Rat Fauci knew Trump was right, but nevertheless contradicted. Bill Gates financed a number of studies that were supposed to undercut the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. They were claiming it caused heart problems and other debilitating, and that you were risking your life if you took hydroxychloroquine, which is all complete and total rubbish. Complete and total rubbish. Based on my research, I can assure you the opposite is the case. In fact, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine have been around for at least 50 years now, and they've been very successful, widespread. In fact, it was early on noted that in countries that suffer from malaria, there were very few instances of the COVID virus, and that's because they were taking anti-malarial medications like hydroxychloroquine. I do intermittent interviews with Stu Webb, who's a federal whistleblower, and Stu has been pointing out what is certainly the case, namely that tonic includes quinine, which is also an anti-malarial element, and that if you drink, my answer therefore is, since gin and tonic is one of my favorite drinks, it's my anti-COVID medication. Meanwhile now, because the Democrats were so worried that we were going to have a V-shaped decline and then a V-shaped recovery, which was already starting to take place, that's when they had the way of counting these COVID tests redefined. The whole thing is a manufactured phenomenon. It turns out that if you look at the serious students, Sherry Tenpenny is good. Dr. Erickson and his colleague from California are good. Dr. Butara is excellent. Many others are out there. Judy Mikovits, wonderful, brilliant. You'll find these are reliable sources that are debunking the pandemic scenario. But the Democrats are so fearful of losing the election that they're holding on for dear life. More recent studies have confirmed that the blacks are standing with Trump, where a more recent poll showed 37% of blacks were planning to support Trump. Now, the Democrats cannot possibly win elections if you had half that percentage supporting the Republican candidate. They can't do it. It won't work mathematically. So what they're trying to do, it has multiple facets. They have nominated Joe Biden, who is brain damaged. He suffered from multiple aneurysm. He's cognitively impaired. He can't make a coherent speech. He can't talk 5 minutes off a teleprompter without a gaffe or wandering off the stage. They're using the COVID cover to keep him locked away in a basement. And I'm very confident they're going to try one or another strategy, among which is the idea of nominating Michelle Obama to be his running mate. Now, there are all kinds of advantages to doing that. Michelle is widely admired. It immediately makes her husband, Barack, relevant politically again. It'll do a lot to draw the black vote back to the Democrat Party. It also allows her, because she's an inexperienced political figure, to refuse to debate with Mike Pence, who would no doubt mop the floor with her, and to stand in solidarity. Joe Biden, who wouldn't have a snowball's chance in hell of staying on the same platform with Donald Trump, will use that as the same rationale for not debating. They're hoping they can parlay all of this in efforts to blame Donald Trump for the COVID virus, compounded by the lawlessness that the Democrats have encouraged after the George Floyd death in Minnesota, which I have to tell you, unfortunately, was a staged event. George Floyd did not die from having his neck kneeled upon by an officer. The way they pulled the magic stunt in that instance was to arrest and manacle George Floyd with his hands behind his back. They got him into a squad car, which is typically the key move to drive off to a precinct and have an individual booked and mugshots taken. Instead of doing that, they seemingly pulled him out the opposite side of the car. Only now what you see lying on the ground is a guy who suddenly is bald, whereas before he was put in the squad car, he had hair on his head. He's no longer manacled. You can see a hand in front. And what they've actually done is a stunt that's given away when he's lifted and put onto a gurney because it has no legs. It's an African-American medical torso made by Sigma 7 Medical Appliance Company, which was among the very first to depart from Minneapolis when all this went down, no doubt apprehensive that they'd be pilloried, tarred, and feathered if it were revealed that they'd been participants in this elaborate hoax. But the Democrats have been fostering it, the looting, the rioting, the lawlessness. It's gone on unabated, not only in Minneapolis, which is proposing to disband their police department, than which there could not be a more ridiculous idiotic idea in the political history of the United States. You have the governors and mayors in Seattle and Washington, Portland and Oregon, who are letting lawless Antifa, Black Lives Matter go wild. And now, because the Donald has actually taken some action by sending in federal marshals and other federal agents to restore law and order, which is completely appropriate, they're talking about him as using a secret police force when it's well advertised. He's talked about it. There's nothing secret about it. So that we're now shaping up with a contest between Democrats who are promoting lawlessness and want to defund the police, and in many cases are moving forward with that absurd agenda, versus a man they're trying to make out to be some kind of authoritarian dictator and racist, which everyone who's ever known Donald Trump denies. He could not have been a successful builder in New York City if he didn't have good relations with all members of all races in the contracting business. But let me tell you, they're counting on two factors. Number one, they are deliberately rigging the polls to make it look as though Joe Biden actually has around a 9 or 10 point advantage over Trump, and they are also moving for mail-in ballots on the basis of the claim that the COVID pandemic requires mail-in ballots. Well, mail-in ballots are the easiest to rig. I mean, that's a sure recipe for them to steal the election. And the fact is that they're rigging the polls to make it look as though Biden has 10% more, because they're counting on Google to give them a 10-point bump when the voting takes place. So what they're doing is laying a foundation for a completely artificial 10-point bump provided by Google, which combined with mail-in ballots, they hope is going to allow them to escape the clutches of Donald Trump, where, by the by, and I also have done a story on Pizzagate, which is the American franchise of pedogate, child trafficking and sex abuse, aspects of which are absolutely horrific, but which involve many prominent members of the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton, Huma Abedin, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, I have no doubt, would be swept up by draining the swamp and punishing all those involved in child trafficking and sex abuse. You can find the evidence there at JimTheConspiracyGuy.com. Let me add that among the other motives going on here are ones that reach out to Barack Obama and Michelle. Among the WikiLeaks correspondence that were released along the way by Julian Assange was one explained how Barack Obama had spent $35,000 of taxpayer money to fly hot dogs and pizza in from Chicago for a private party at the White House. Well, that's very odd on multiple counts. The first being that if you're talking about real hot dogs and real pizza, obviously flying in from Chicago would be silly, because they wouldn't be fresh and worth eating at the time. Not only that, but it turns out that the White House has an absolute prohibition against food being brought in from outside sources. So what was really going on? It turns out that in the slang of Pizzagate, hot dog is an expression for little boys, pizza for little girls. So Barack Obama spent $35,000 U.S. taxpayer money flying little boys and little girls in from Chicago for a private party at the White House. If you thought that could not be topped, and you can see the evidence right there in my conspiracy guy show about Pizzagate, let me add the zinger. They want Michelle Obama to be the savior of the Democratic Party, but there's a certain risk that is thereby engendered. Michelle Obama was born Michael LaVaughn Robinson, played football at Oregon State, was pretty good with his number of tackles and so forth, before he transferred to Princeton and adopted a female persona as Michelle Robinson. We have photographs of Michael and Barack with a young Bill Gates, and Michael, as the case for other men, has a noticeable lack of the female anatomy, no breasts. He has no breasts. On the other hand, subsequently, we find photographs of Michelle where she appears to have an ample bosom, but also a package most women do not have. Well, the physician who attended her during campaign stop, Trenton, on one of Barack's campaigns, walked into her taking a leak in a standing up and wanted to explain to the public, though he was paid millions for his silence, that Michelle Obama is not a man who had a sex change. Michelle Obama is simply a man with breast implants and a huge shaving bill. Joan Rivers sought to tell us way back when, being questioned about whether we'd ever have now that we'd had a black president, whether we'd ever have a gay president. She observed, well, we already have that with Obama. And she said, and we all know, everyone knows that Michelle is a transgender. Well, not in the normal sense. So I think that if they run Michelle, and you'll find I document all this also at the end of the Pizzagate, and I think perhaps also at the end of Hold a Spot a False Flag, the country's in for some big surprises. Let me just mention that I have no problem if people want to vote for a man with breast implants and a huge shaving bill. They simply need to know who they're voting for. I frankly do not believe this scam is going to work, because who better to rebuild the American economy once it's been devastated by this fake coronavirus, this scamdemic, than the man who gave us the most robust economy in our history and soaring stock markets, Donald J. Trump. So, while they're going to make monster efforts to sabotage the election and steal it, don't let it happen. I'd say at this point in time, if you are willing to vote for a Democrat, you better think twice. They are the party of lawlessness and disorder. And if you're not already a gun owner, frankly, it's in your best interest to learn how to shoot, master marksmanship, purchase some weapons for your own self-defense, because frankly, your life may depend upon it.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's amazing. Did you briefly mention what's going on in Portland and Seattle and all these? They're just burning. There's lots of looting, or not looting, but
yes, I mentioned Portland and Seattle in passing, where the mayors are absurd. The mayor of Portland, for example, actually got out to join the Antifa Black Lives Matter crowd, and instead he was jostled, threatened, told he needed to resign. We have a mayor in Oakland who was sympathetic until they came to her own home, and now she's regarding them as terrorists. In Seattle, it's absolutely despicable how the mayor of Seattle allowed 6 blocks of downtown Seattle to be taken over by a group of anarchists to greet Chaz, and where they discovered almost immediately they had to have their own law enforcement, and where it turned out that multiple crimes were being committed in Chaz, including a murder and rape, to which the local police were not allowed to respond. Now, if you want the United States to turn into an elaborate version of Portland and Seattle, then vote Democrat. If you like the country the way it was, with a semblance of law and order, vote Republican. It's that stark a choice.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible what's going on, and I hear the Federal Reserve keeps on, pumping the Fed, pumping the quantitative easing and all that, and stock market is going up, economy is going up, so it's very interesting to see how this is all going to play out, especially with the election coming up here, and yeah.
Well, you've often heard, people say this election is the most important in history. Well, I'll just tell you, this election is the most important in history.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to be very interesting how it goes, because I don't think either side is willing to capitulate. So, but you never know, because the people at the top, they play both sides, and at the end of the day, it's very hard to, figure it out. Figure out what it is.
Frankly,
what their plans are.
That may have been true of many past elections. I even voted for Bill Clinton twice. I even voted for Barack Obama twice. That had a lot to do with their opponents. I could not vote for Mitt Romney or for John McCain. But in this election, I think it's very clear cut. You got a brain damaged candidate on the one hand, and you got a virtual wizard on the other. You got a brain damaged candidate who is willing to support Black Lives and Antifa and lawlessness and wants to trade on, Michelle Obama's skirt by running with her, which I predict is going to happen. There's a marvelous piece in American Thinker about it, which, however, was absent the knowledge that Michelle Obama is actually a man with breast implants. So I just say, I don't think there's anything remotely difficult to choose. I think this election is a no-brainer. If you want to preserve the United States with some degree of integrity, you have to vote for Donald in spite of such warts as he may have. He's an imperfect human being, but he's kept us out of war. I've been severely critical of some things he has done, but I'm telling you, the other side is cashing in the economy, destroying the American people, leading to more deaths because of this lockdown, which was completely unjustified from the beginning, from suicide. You're going to have more deaths from the failure to have ordinary medical screening because of the devotion of all these resources to mostly imaginary coronavirus patients. You're going to have lost educational opportunity, which are going to continue, that are going to be devastating because they cannot be made up. I'm just telling you the consequences of this scheme to take out Trump by destroying the economy, knowing full well that the two greatest assets an incumbent normally has heading into a re-election is the strength of the economy and the stock market. Trump had both. I point out, by the way, that he's willing to sacrifice his own self-interest for that of the nation when he was convinced by Tony the Rat and Deborah Brooks that the Neil Ferguson model from Imperial College, for which had been paid for by Bill Gates, that 2.2 million Americans were expected to die and 500,000 Brits if the economies weren't shut down. Trump didn't. He shut down the economy. In retrospect, of course, it's become obvious that he was played. But the point I make is, the man is no narcissist. The man has great empathy and compassion, and he was even willing to sacrifice the greatest strengths he had coming into the re-election to protect the American people. He is putting America first. The Democrats, by contrast, are putting their party ahead of the American people.
It's pretty incredible, and I couldn't agree more. Hopefully, also, the Ghislaine Maxwell arrest debacle story keeps on going on as well, and hopefully we can all keep updated on that as well. Just follow the paper trail, follow the money, see what's going on.
Another time.
That's right. Thank you very much, Jim. Take care.
My pleasure. You got it.
Have a great one.